In the words of the Reverend Gretchen Haley, we are keepers of hope, holders of memory, storytellers and song weavers pulling on this thread of truth. We are here to do the work of hope, remembering the past, remembering ourselves, imagining our most possible future for this life that teeters too often on the edge of forgetting we belong to each other.
Hi. Do you know what's in your church's archives? We didn't either. But last year we heard about the Reverend Jeffrey W. Campbell, a mid-century black minister who dedicated his many talents first to the Universalist denomination and then to the Unitarian Universalist denomination. We found that he, his sister Marguerite, and his mother were members of the Universalist Church of Nashua, which joined with the Unitarians in 1957 to become the UU Church of Nashua. That makes Jeffrey Campbell a direct part of our spiritual DNA. So we formed a small study group to research the life and achievements of Jeffrey and Marguerite Campbell.
Jeffrey Campbell was not a name that was in any of the history written about this congregation, and we wondered why. We combed our church archives and the local newspaper files, tracked down and spoke with his two daughters, queried churches where we knew he had worked, and sifted through books, articles, and correspondence relevant to Jeffrey Campbell. This journey led us to discover that Jeffrey, his mother Lillian, and sister Marguerite were all buried in an unmarked grave in Edgewood Cemetery here in Nashua. Motivated by this ultimate denial of the worth and dignity of the Campbell family, we knew we had to do something. We set about raising money for a proper gravestone and planned and presented a service of remembrance and reconciliation on the 22nd of September 2018. We were blessed with the formal greetings from members of local communities of color, along with Carrie McDonald, UUA Executive Vice President. The following are excerpts from that service and the dedication of the new gravestone.
So this is a brief outline of the life stories of Jeffrey and Marguerite Campbell. The Campbell family moved to Nashua from Boston in about 1919. Jeffrey was 9 and Marguerite was 3. Their mother Lillian was white. Jeffrey Sr., the father, was black, and he was killed in a racially motivated attack when Jeffrey was 12. Jeffrey, Marguerite, and Lillian soon became active in the Nashua Universalist Church. But almost from the beginning, Jeffrey remembers suspicious whispers about him and his sister as the only black children in the church. In his essay, Personality, Not Pigmentation, Jeffrey wrote, quote, "By the time I was 12 years of age, the paradox between intention and action of universalism was shaking that little church. With each stage of my development, the paradox grew sharper. Should I take a role in this or that pageant? What would the conference say if I were to represent the church? Should I be asked to teach a class?" In a letter later in his life, Jeffrey expressed his sadness at never having been invited to preach here at the church in Nashua, where he first found his lifelong faith. After graduating from Nashua High School, Jeffrey entered the theological school at St. Lawrence University in upstate New York. He was the first African American to enter this school, and his presence immediately presented a challenge and a soul-searching within the Universalist denomination. The Dean of St. Lawrence, John Murray Atwood, recognized Jeffrey's gifts and believed he should be given a chance, but denominational officials were less sure it was worthwhile to support Jeffrey on his path to ministry. When the Winthrop, New York Universalist Church wrote to the National Universalist Office asking whether or not they should ordain Jeffrey, the response from Superintendent Roger Etz was less than enthusiastic. Quote, "Personally, I have no color prejudice, and theoretically there should not be any in our churches. Practically speaking, however, there is bound to be. I hardly know what to advise in regard to his ordination. Of course, if it is carried through, he will expect us to try to find him a church, and frankly, I don't know where he can be located." Roger Etz was not far off in his prediction for Jeffrey Campbell's ministry. After graduating in 1933 and being ordained as a Universalist minister in 1935, Jeffrey was never able to find a permanent full-time position in ministry. His race overshadowed all other considerations of his resume, despite glowing recommendation from the people who knew him. He supported himself with part-time and temporary positions and became an activist and a leader in the Universalist youth ministry. In 1939, Campbell won a fellowship to study theology in England from the peace organization Fellowship of Reconciliation. Soon after he arrived in England, World War II began. He declared himself a conscientious objector and supported himself after his fellowship expired by teaching returning soldiers and their families.
Shortly before leaving for England, Jeffrey officiated the wedding of his sister Marguerite and Francis Davis, a white man who studied theology at St. Lawrence University with Jeffrey. On August 12, 1939, John Van Skyke, the editor of the Universalist journal The Christian Leader, published an editorial entitled "Idealism and Realism in Mixed Marriages," in which he condemned mixed marriages. The editorial was a thinly veiled attack on the Davis-Campbell wedding and on Jeffrey Campbell's role as an officiant. Quote, "Would it be right to withhold a Universalist pulpit from a man who has contracted a marriage of this kind?" Van Skyke wrote. Quote, "It would be right, because this man cannot do the work. It would be right, as it would be right not to call a man who could not read, who could not enunciate, or had met with an accident that had imposed a handicap not to be overcome." End quote. Unfortunately, Van Skyke knew his fellow Universalists. Francis Davis never found a pulpit and instead became a social worker. Jeffrey responded a few months later through his essay, "Personality, Not Pigmentation." He wrote of many instances of, quote, "the paradox between intention and action," end quote, that he had experienced in the Universalist denomination. Throughout the article, Jeffrey writes not only of his disappointment in Universalism to live up to its ideals, but also his unwavering faith that it was a denomination worth supporting nonetheless. He describes Universalists as a, quote, "band of men and women who, in the increasing chaos, can see a new heaven and a new earth," end quote. And it is clear that he writes this article because he truly believed Universalism can and should be the faith that it declares itself to be. Like her brother, Marguerite was dedicated to the Universalist denomination. In the 1950s, Marguerite began work with the Universalist Christian Association in Boston and continued to serve the denomination after the merger after the merger resulted in the Unitarian Universalist Association. Marguerite only retired from this work shortly before she died. There is not as much documentation about Marguerite's life as there is Jeffrey's, so we can only imagine here what it would have been like for her to serve a denomination that continuously refused to respect her, her brother, and her husband. In a letter to us from one of Jeffrey's daughters, she refers to Marguerite as, quote, the saddest woman I have ever known, end quote. After his return to the United States from England in 1951, Jeffrey took a position teaching English at the Putney School in Vermont. He remained on the faculty there for the rest of his life, while also trying repeatedly to gain a full-time position as a UU minister. He never succeeded. He did serve as a part-time minister at the Unitarian Universalist Church in Amherst, Massachusetts, and then as an on-call minister for the Unitarian Universalist Church of Brattleboro, Vermont, a position for which he was not paid.
We gather here today to remember and honor Lillian Campbell, Reverend Jeffrey Campbell, and Marguerite Campbell Davis. All three were members of the First Universalist Society of Nashua in the first half of the 20th century. All three served their faith, Lillian as a church secretary, Jeffrey as a minister, and Marguerite as denominational staff. And all three were subject to discrimination from their fellow Universalists and Unitarian Universalists. Jeffrey and Marguerite, because they were biracial, children of a black father and a white mother, and Lillian as the mother of biracial children. For the past year and a half, members of the Unitarian Universalist Church of Nashua have been researching the lives of the Campbell family. Early in this research, we discovered that Lillian, Jeffrey, and Marguerite were buried here in an unmarked grave in this cemetery. As we learned more about the ways that Jeffrey and Marguerite in particular had been discriminated against and pushed away by our spiritual ancestors and forgotten in our congregational history, this unmarked grave seemed like the ultimate example of their lives being erased and forgotten. In February, after receiving the blessing of Jeffrey's daughters to erect a stone on this gravesite, our congregation started fundraising to purchase and place this stone that you see here today. Within less than a week, we had raised enough money for a proper marker to recognize the lives of these dedicated Universalists. And today we dedicate this marker in memory of Lillian, Jeffrey, and Marguerite, and we dedicate ourselves to keeping their memory alive. As you leave this place, I invite you to take the flower you were given when you arrived, or get one from Lori if you didn't get one, and place it on Lillian, Jeffrey, and Marguerite's grave. May that flower be a symbol of your commitment to keep the Campbell's memory alive, to keep on seeking out and telling the stories of those who have been forgotten by history, and to do your part to make Jeffrey Campbell's dream of a world in which all are treated with dignity into a reality. May we commit to all of that today. Go in peace. Go in love. In August, our Board of Trustees voted to name our chapel after the Campbell family. The Campbell Chapel will honor the legacies of Lillian, Jeffrey, and Marguerite, while at the same time serving as a physical reminder here in our church of a time in our history when our spiritual ancestors did not live out our principles. Each time we use the Campbell Chapel, we will rededicate ourselves to living out our values so that we might become the faith that Jeffrey believed we could be.
Today, we formally dedicate our Campbell Chapel. In doing so, we also dedicate ourselves to the ongoing work of justice and love. May the Campbell Chapel be a place of commitment,
a place where we remind ourselves what it is our faith calls us to be in the world and commit to living out our principles.
May the Campbell Chapel be a place of growth,
a place where we are willing to embrace the discomfort that comes before transformation.
May the Campbell Chapel be a place of compassion,
a place where we nurture in ourselves a spirit of love for all.
May the Campbell Chapel be a place of hope,
a place where we remember the vision of a new heaven and a new earth that Jeffrey Campbell believed our faith could usher in. May it be so.